Let's take a look at how to add styles and scripts through our hook. It's pretty straightforward. There are only 2 steps required to add styles to our pages. The first step is to register the style. Registering style simply means that you're telling WordPress that you have a style sheet and you would like WordPress to know its location along with other details. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to learn all about registering styles. In order to register a style, we use the WP register style function. Under the notes section, you'll see that we're using this function correctly because it says, use the WP enqueues scripts action to call this function. Calling it outside of an action can lead to problems. Since we're doing that already, it's safe to assume we can use this function. This function has 2 required parameters. The first parameter is the handle name. The handle name can be thought of as a unique name or ID for reference. The second parameter is the source of the style sheet. Let's go back to the enqueue function and use this function. Alright, so let's call the WP register style function and let's pass in a handle for the first parameter. If we go back to the index template, you'll see we have quite a few style sheets being loaded. The first style sheet is a Google font, so let's call this handle JU Google Fonts. Just like functions, it's also common practice to prefix our handles with some initials. For the second parameter, let's pass in the URL. We're loading these fonts from a CDN, so we can just paste the URL like so as a string. Next up is the bootstrap.css file. And just like before, I'm going to use the same naming convention. The name will be JU Bootstrap. Unlike the fonts, this file is located within our theme directory. We'll use WordPress to help us generate a URL to this file. There's actually a function that will always point to the current theme directory. This makes it easier on us as we don't have to perform checks if the owner of the site changed the name of the theme directory. This function is called getTemplateDirectory URI. You do not have to pass in anything, and you don't have to include any files to get this function to work. This function is loaded and created for you by WordPress. You may notice that this function has a similar name to the getTemplateDirectory function. The difference between these 2 functions is the URI version will actually get the web URL. The non-URI version gets the system path. Right after this, I'm going to append the path relative to our theme folder, which is assets/css/bootstrap.css. Now that we have that finished, I'm going to register the rest of the styles. It's the same as before. Even though this function has more parameters, they aren't really needed for our theme, so we won't be going over them. However, feel free to take a look at them and mess around with it. Pause the video if you need to have what I have. If we refresh the page, you'll notice that this won't work just yet. We've only registered our styles. Now we must tell WordPress we would like to add it to our page. We now have to use a function called WP enqueue style. I've also included a link to this function in the resource section of this lecture. This function has 1 required parameter, which is the handle name of the style we registered earlier. You'll notice that the other parameters are similar to the WP register style function. However, these are only available just in case you forget to register a style. You should always register a style though. The difference between registering and enqueuing a file is that registering would tell WordPress about a style sheet and make it available to be called later on, while enqueuing will instruct WordPress to load our style sheet onto the page right away. You will not always want to enqueue a style onto every page as it is inefficient. There's also plugins out there that will sometimes scan registered styles and perform actions such as minifying and concatenating style sheets together. So it's best to register first and then enqueue. Let's enqueue the font style sheet. Right after registering, call the function WP enqueue style and pass in the handle name JU Google Fonts. Let's do this for all the style sheets. Alright, we're almost done, I promise. There's only one last thing we need to do in order for all this to work. If we go back to the index template, you'll notice we haven't told WordPress where to load our style sheets. Our template is pure HTML. WordPress doesn't magically scan our files and insert everything in the appropriate place. We have to tell WordPress where to load our files. So let's do that. Go to the head section of our template. We are going to replace the style sheets and call the function WP-head. The WP-head function is a function defined by WordPress. This function simply tells WordPress this is the spot where themes and plugins can enqueue their style sheet and script files. Let's refresh the page and we should see it working. If you see something similar to what I see, then you're good to go. Let's double check some things and open up the console. You'll notice we get a lot of errors, but we'll fix these soon. What I want you to look for is any 404 errors related to style sheets. If you don't see any, then that means you loaded everything correctly. We can now begin adding scripts. Adding a script file is almost the same as adding a style sheet. However, unlike style sheets, we can load script files in the footer. If we take a look at the template, we have all our scripts being loaded into the footer. Just like adding files inside the head tag, we also have to call a function from the footer to instruct WordPress where to load files in the footer. At the very bottom of the template, right before the closing body tag, call the WP footer function. This function allows our theme and other plugins to load their files into the footer. Alright, now that we have that set up, let's go to the enqueue function and start adding our scripts. Just like style sheets, we have to register our scripts. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the WP register style function. Let's take a look at what WordPress has to say about this function. As you can see, only the first two parameters are required, and they're basically similar to the WP register style function. Back inside the index template, we include a script called plugins. Let's add the script to the footer through the enqueue function. So let's call the WP register script function and pass in a handle name. The handle name will be JU plugins. I don't have to worry about naming conflicts here because style sheets and scripts are stored separately. The second parameter is the source. It's the same as last time. You just call the getTemplate directory URI function and append the path. Now in most cases, you always want to load your scripts in the footer to allow our content to be loaded before our scripts. So how do we make our scripts load in the footer? Let's go back to the WordPress codex and take a look at the WP register script function again. You'll notice that the fifth parameter determines whether or not a script is loaded in the footer. By default, it doesn't. We have to pass in a true Boolean value so that we can load the script inside the footer. Let's go back to the function and start using this. The third parameter is the script's dependencies. In some cases, your script will depend on the functionality of another script. You have to pass in an array of handle names for WordPress to make sure those scripts are loaded first before this one. In our case, we don't have to worry about dependencies, so we'll just pass in an empty array. The fourth parameter is the version of the script. If you update your script frequently, this can be a useful parameter to set. This is because a lot of WordPress sites have cache enabled. By updating the version, you'll force WordPress to load the latest version of this script. I'm going to set this to false as I don't really need to worry about versioning for this script. The whole point of this part of the lecture is to load the script into the footer, which is the fifth and final parameter. All you have to do is pass in true. That's it. Let's enqueue the plugins file using the WP enqueue script function and see if it loads on the page. You'll also notice that WordPress also loads its top nav bar for users who are logged in. After confirming that it loads, why don't you pause the video and load the rest of the scripts? Be sure to remove the script tags after you enqueued them. Alright, so I basically just registered and enqueued the rest of our scripts. You'll notice that I also removed their inclusions from the footer. If I refresh the page, you'll see that everything is loaded correctly, except for one thing, jQuery. We also get a couple of errors inside the console saying that jQuery isn't loaded or defined. In the enqueue file, I didn't bother registering or even enqueuing it, but why? Let's go back to the WordPress codex and take a look at the WP register script function. On the content sidebar, I want you to click Core Registered Scripts. You'll be taken to a part of the page that tells you that WordPress registers a number of scripts that are commonly used by developers. WordPress automatically registers a large number of scripts. Libraries like jQuery UI and underscore. If we scroll down long enough, you'll find jQuery. So all we have to do is enqueue the script before enqueuing anything else. Let's do this now. Refresh the page, and if you did everything right, then you should see any errors related to jQuery are now gone. Now, before I end this lecture, I want to say one very important thing. Never ever override WordPress's default scripts, including jQuery. There are some developers out there that like to include their own versions of jQuery, which may seem great and all, but it's really not a good idea. You aren't the only developer using jQuery. If developers constantly use their own versions of the scripts, this could break a client site and can cause hours of debugging. It's so much better to just use a jQuery version that's consistent throughout the site. Inside the HTML template, we use a different version of jQuery, but that's only for the HTML template and not meant to be used for the WordPress theme at all. So please don't try and override WordPress's jQuery.